A blessed and a pleasant afternoon to each and everyone. I am Lovely B. Mendoza from BSED English 3B, and I am your discussant for the topic Factors Affecting Task Difficulty. I only have three requests for the discussion. First, listen attentively. Second, write down important points. And lastly, reflect. I'm humbly asking you this, my co-students, as the main goal of the discussion is to meet the following target learning outcomes flashed on your screen. This discussion aim is fourfold. First goal will be to explain Skehan's limited capacity model and its three main categories when assessing second language task difficulty. Second objective will be to demonstrate the relationships of three main characteristic types of Robinson's framework. Third will be to organize main points of Alice criteria for task grading. And lastly, to evaluate and contrast the three major factors affecting task difficulty. In line with the objectives, my discussion will attempt to answer what is a task, what is task complexity, and how can task complexity affect the production of language. Having that said, let's start already.
Definitions of task.
In the second language acquisition field, a number of definitions of task have been provided by different authors and from multiple perspectives. Michael Long provides a definition of task in its everyday meaning. As per him, task is a piece of work undertaken for oneself or for others, freely or for some reward.
Thus, examples of tasks include painting a fence, making an airline reservation, borrowing a library book, taking a driving test, typing a letter, and so on.
In its most basic sense, task is meant 101 things people do in everyday life, at work, at play, and in between. These are the things people will tell you about what they do if you ask them, and they are not applied linguists. To Long's definition, Crook's suggestion that the category task has a psychological reality can be added.
It has been shown that the category task, as used by researchers generally, is widely applicable and has a psychological reality. Much, if not most, of human activity, whether in employment or in the classroom, can be seen a series of tasks, some having a communicative aspect, others not. Elaborating on one of the tasks in Long's example, a rather simple task in which language is not involved would be painting a fence. In order to carry out the task, some kind of brush, paint, sandpaper, and a fence are required. The steps include gathering materials, sanding the wood, giving it a couple of coats, and letting it dry. The goal is to make the fence look nicer, and the task has a tangible outcome that we can see.
Language would not necessarily be required for this task. In Galbert, an example of a complex task in which language is required was provided, interviewing a source in the domain of journalism. This would include a number of steps or subtasks such as gathering information about the source, contacting the source, documenting the interview, making arrangements for the interview, interviewing the source, and writing the transcript or an article based on the interview. It should be made clear that these are what Long refers to as target tasks and they do not correspond exactly to the kind of tasks that are used in instructional context, which is what we now turn to.
Pedagogic tasks.
As far as pedagogic tasks are concerned, Skehan takes a task-based instruction perspective to define tasks and bases his definition on those previously advanced by Candlin, Noonan, and Long. Skehan identifies a task as
A task is an activity in which meaning is primary. There is some kind of communication problem to solve. There is some sort of relationship to comparable real-world activities. Task completion has some priority. The assessment of the task is in terms of outcome. According to Bygate, however, Skehan's definition is not quite complete. Apart from the ideas of the primacy of meaning, the existence of an objective and the possibility of assessment, there is the fact that tasks are susceptible to pedagogic intervention, be it brief or extended, as well as the idea that tasks can be influenced by learner choice and can be potentially reinterpreted by learners.
Following Candlin, Swales adds two more traits to the definition of task.
The idea that tasks are differentiated and sequentiable is clearly valuable. The fact that tasks can be seen to have beginnings, middles, and ends provides an orientation for learners against the often opaque background of a course or syllabus. In addition, they provide objectives for learners and establish landmarks of achievement. Tasks are clearly sequentiable both in practice and theory, although there currently exist considerable doubts as to the validity of the criteria by which tasks can be ordered.
Long and Crooks claim that tasks of this kind provide the grounds for acquisitional processes to operate. Tasks can also be manipulated for different empirical purposes and to test different theoretical constructs in both classroom and experimental settings. In this way, researchers usually propose a series of operationalizations that may affect either their internal structure, their interactional design, or the conditions under which they are performed in order to test and measure their effects on learners' comprehension, production, or learning. Another definition of task derived from task-based language teaching or TBLT. As per TBLT, tasks are work plans that provide learners with the materials they need to achieve an outcome specified in communicative rather than linguistic terms.
For example, in the heart transplant, task learners are given information about four people requiring a heart transplant, told that only one heart is available, and asked to decide who is most deserving of the transplant.
Such a task may lack situational authenticity, but the interaction that it gives rise to is likely to resemble the interaction that occurs when people engage together to solve a problem in real life. It is in this sense that such a task can be considered to lead to interactionally authentic language use.
It is interactional authenticity that is fundamental in TBLT. Although, when it is possible to identify the specific target tasks a group of learners will need to perform, as in the case of specific purpose language teaching, situational authenticity also becomes important. Language learning arises from the interactions generated by a task, whether this is situationally authentic or pedagogic in nature.
A crucial aspect of task-based talk, then, is focus on form. As learners communicate, attention is drawn to the precise linguistic features that learners must comprehend or to provide in pursuit of achieving the result of the task.
This may be achieved in an exceedingly number of proactive and reactive ways. The teacher can prime the learner with the language they all must perform a task, or he or she can fit this language into the particular performance of the task by responding to their efforts to speak, as an example, by negotiating for meaning or for form.
So during this way, tasks don't just promote fluency but accuracy also. Task-based teaching requires a primary target meaning, but it also provides for attention on form. So its strength lies with the undeniable fact that attention to create is contextualized in learners' own attempts to form meaning.
It helps learners to determine what linguistic forms they have to precise the messages they require to grasp or produce.
During this way, it helps learners to determine how form is mapped onto the meanings that are important to them as they perform a task.
There are additional ways to gain insights into what types of factors might be useful to consider when grading tasks, including the collection of learner perception data and or expert opinions about sources of task difficulty. We are now going to tackle a detailed discussion of how often overlapping factors are proposed to be manipulated to facilitate the effectiveness of task-based syllabuses is beyond the scope. We first look at the task taxonomies proposed in Skehan's limited capacity model and Robinson's triadic componential framework, followed by a review of Ellis' task framework. Models of task difficulty.
The limited capacity model. Skehan's conceptions of task-based learning comes from a communicative approach to task-based teaching, which has been concerned, among other issues, with how task and syllabus design can contribute to the interlanguage development. In Skehan's view, both task manipulation and sequencing for syllabus design should be based not just on intuitions about difficulty, but on empirical findings.
For Skehan and Foster, task difficulty has to do with the amount of attention the task demands from the participants. Difficult tasks require more attention than easy tasks.
Having evidence of the effects of task demands on production can be used to direct learners' efforts toward different areas of performance separately or simultaneously. In addition to that, if links are established between production and acquisition, research evidence can be used to manipulate tasks to maximize the effectiveness of language learning. He suggests that information should be collected regarding the effects of task manipulation on the areas of fluency, accuracy, and complexity. Skehan proposed utilizing three categories when assessing second language task difficulty, and those are first, code complexity, second, cognitive complexity, and lastly, communicative stress. Code complexity refers to the linguistic obligations that a task places on you. Tasks that require the usage of more complex and diverse structures are likely to be more challenging. When learners must use more advanced, varied, and dense lexis, they should anticipate or expect to have more difficulties so that tasks' linguistic needs are addressed through code complexity. Cognitive complexity captures the task-induced processes. Skehan distinguishes between cognitive familiarity and cognitive processing within this category, with cognitive familiarity referring to the ability to handle familiar information more easily and cognitive processing referring to the additional demands placed on processing when new solutions are required. Familiarity with the topic, discourse type, and task may all contribute to cognitive familiarity. On the other hand, if the information needed to complete the job is less organized, plain, and unambiguous, cognitive processing demands may rise. When a task necessitates a higher quantity of processing, such as manipulating and converting data, cognitive demands are expected to grow. The substance of a task and the organization of task material are both factors in cognitive complexity. Communicative stress, the third category in Skehan's model, is concerned with the conditions of performance in which the work is accomplished. When a job is completed under time constraints, more people are engaged, real-time processing is necessary, there is more at risk, and there's no option to change how the task is completed, the task difficulty is likely to rise. Communicative stress is always concerned with performance issues.
These three aspects, according to Skehan and Foster, may impact how learners' attention is likely to be shared throughout a task and how language performance is influenced. However, it is unclear which of these characteristics is most important in defining job difficulty or how they interact. As a consequence, the limited capacity model does not make any specific suggestions as to how these dimensions should be operationalized. Skehan takes linguistic complexity to be a surrogate of learners' willingness to stretch their interlanguage by experimenting with more difficult forms and by trying out more elaborate language. In his view, the information obtained from the manipulation of task features can be used to establish longer-term pedagogic goals in which both meaning and form can be attended to and in which interlanguage development can be integrated into fluent performance.
Their starting point is language instruction, which, in their view, should foster a balanced improvement in the three areas of production. Information about how fluency, complexity, and accuracy as affected by increasing task demands should be used to arrange individual tasks in a principled way in a long-term instructional sequence, which will promote such balanced development. However, Skehan and Foster's principled ways is in need of further exploration, I think. The Triadic Componential Framework. Robinson, in what he referred to as the Triadic Componential Framework, also outlines a taxonomy of task characteristics in order to provide syllabus designers with operational criteria that can be used to classify and sequence tasks. Robinson's framework includes three main characteristic types: factors contributing to task complexity, task conditions, and task difficulty. Task complexity variables affect the task's intrinsic cognitive demands. Task complexity looks to be comparable to Skehan's definition of cognitive complexity. According to Robinson, the level of complexity should be the sole criterion for making syllabus sequencing selections. Task complexity can be enhanced by manipulating tasks along two types of tasks dimensions. First, resource directing, and second, resource dispersing. By definition, resource directing characteristics are related to conceptual task needs. For example, activities that require learners to engage in causal, intentional, or spatial reasoning, description of events that are displaced in time and space, and or reference to many elements rather than a few are likely to put increased conceptual demands on learners. Resource directing characteristics, according to Robinson, have the ability to direct learners' attention to specific, task-relevant language elements. Tasks that involve causal reasoning, for example, are more likely to inspire extensive usage of logical connections. The procedural requirements of task execution, on the other hand, are dealt with by resource dispersing dimensions. When learners must perform many tasks at once rather than just one, little or no preparation time is provided, the task's structure is unclear, and or more steps are required to accomplish the work, task demands are expected to rise. Task conditions include variables that influence interactional task demands and subsume factors related to the interactional partners and the level and nature of participation required. Participant-related factors, for example, consider if participants are the same gender, have the same proficiency level, and have the same position and function. Task demands may also change based on how well the partners know each other and how much material and cultural background they share, whether the task allows for multiple or one predetermined solution, whether the participants must converge on the task's outcome or can diverge, whether the task's instructions call for one-way or two-way interaction, whether the participants must contribute more or less during the task's performance, and or whether the task-based interaction involves two or more participants. Finally, task difficulty recognizes that individual variations in ability, such as their aptitude and emotion, for example, their anxiety and their fear, can affect task-based performance and growth. It's worth noting that task difficulty is conceived in a broader way in Skehan's work to signify variations in total job demands. Skehan considered tasks to be more difficult if they included any of the three categories of task variables described in the limited capacity model. For example, those are code complexity, cognitive complexity, or communicative stress. Based on the cognition hypothesis, Robinson introduces a framework consisting of three dimensions, namely task complexity, task difficulty, and task conditions. So the table flashed on your screen indicates this triadic framework. Studies in a componential framework for second language task design by Robinson, as table presents, one of the dimensions is task conditions, under which the tasks are accomplished. This concerns the interactive demands of accomplishing tasks, so it is comprised of two subparts: participation variables regarding the information flow, for example, one-way versus two-way, and participant variables with respect to familiarity or gender. Task conditions have to do with how information is distributed and flows among participants. For example, one-way tasks in which one information is held by only one of the participants in a pair who communicates it to the other participant, or a two-way one in which information is equally shared by both participants who must interact in order to accomplish the task objectives. The other dimension is task difficulty, which is learners' perceptions of the demands of the task and is dependent on differences between learners in the cognitive factors, for example, their aptitude and their working memory, and affective variables, for example, their confidence, anxiety, and their self-esteem, that distinguish one learner from another. So this aspect pertains to the learner factors and the way learners perceive the difficulty of the task. Therefore, it is an interlearner variable. By task difficulty, Robinson understands what learners bring to the task and suggests that differentials in ability affect learners' perception of the task with consequences of performance and learning. For example, a learner with low proficiency may find a task so hard that he or she cannot produce or learn anything from it. So task difficulty accounts for between participant variation. The other major dimension in this framework is task complexity, which according to Robinson is the intrinsic cognitive demands of the task which can be manipulated during task design. So these processing demands are imposed by the structure of the task on the learners. Therefore, through empirical investigation, it is possible to determine the specific structure of the task and predict their potential effect on the learner's performance beforehand. Task complexity accounts for within participant variation.
This dimension is an intra-learner variable. Robinson predicts increasing the complexity along the resource-directing variables would bring about less fluency and great complexity and accuracy. That is, negative fluency, positive accuracy, positive complexity, since these dimensions would direct learners' attentional and memory resources to second language system in order to understand and convey the functional complexity. As a result, their attention to second language grammaticalities, that is, accuracy and complexity, in those conceptual domains would increase to the detriment of fluency. On the other hand, tasks manipulated along the resource dispersing dimensions do not direct learners to any particular aspect of language code and would give rise to less fluency, accuracy, and complexity. That is, negative fluency, negative accuracy, and negative complexity.
In Robinson's view, task complexity should be the sole basis for making prospective sequencing decisions. Since task conditions emphasizes participation and participant variables, and task difficulty, which highlights affective and ability variables, cannot be predicted before a course starts and can therefore only inform online decisions. In his view, task performance conditions are determined by a needs analysis. Information about the effects of task complexity on production should help. Alice criteria for task grading. Alice task classification framework delineates four types of task dimensions that can be used by syllabus designers in the task grading processes. Features related to the task input, task conditions, task processes, and lastly, task outcomes. Task conditions, according to Alice, are factors that describe the interaction between the interactants, task demands, and the discourse style generated by the task. Differences in the nature and number of reasoning required are captured by task processes. The distinction between input and outcome related task requirements is a characteristic unique to Alice taxonomy. Alice classified the nature of the medium as one of the input characteristics, categorizing vocal input as the most difficult, followed by written and visual input as the next most difficult.
A second challenge input thing is code complexity. Project input with extra complex vocabulary and syntax is predicted to pose more issue. Cognitive complexity, a third enter-associated issue in Alice framework, defines the undertaking input as extra hard when it smiles greater abstract, includes extra elements and relationships, has much less clear shape, and calls for a there and then orientation. The closing input function in Alice's taxonomy is called as familiarity, encapsulating the expectancy that acquainted input eases processing load.
Elements that describe the project outcome include medium, scope, and discourse mode. With admire to medium, the one to articulate an oral final results is anticipated to pose extra trouble than to offer an outcome in written shape. In turn, a pictorial outcome is deemed easier to deliver than a written piece. Closed versus open outcomes may also influence the level of difficulty. Finally, task difficulty is likely to be enhanced when learners are asked to produce instructions or arguments rather than lists, descriptions, narrative, or classifications.
We now move on to analyze the concept of task complexity, which is central to the main objectives of this discussion. As we will see throughout this section, the concept of task complexity was born from the need to establish criteria for sequencing tasks in a syllabus from easy or simple to difficult or complex in a reasoned way that will foster interlanguage development. Rather than looking at the linguistic features of language activities, syllabi that have used tasks as their units have focused on task design in order to find out how tasks impose cognitive demands on learners.
One of the first attempts at sequencing tasks from simple to complex was advanced by Brown et al. They distinguish among three different types of tasks, which they presented as ranging from easy to difficult. The first type, which is static tasks, was proposed as the easiest type. In this kind of task, all the information to be exchanged is presented to the speaker in the materials for carrying out the task. For example, a map task in which the speaker has to give directions to the listener. The second type, which is dynamic task, also present the speaker with all the information in stimulus materials, but the task can present problems. In such tasks, characters, events, and activities change, and this change forces the speaker to fully describe the stimulus material and be explicit, discriminating, and consistent in his or her use of language. For example, a story in a comic strip in which characters appear and disappear or change places and behaviors over time. The last type, which is abstract task, is the most difficult one since the stimulus material does not contain the content to be communicated. It involves making reference to abstract concepts, establishing connections between ideas, and providing reasons for certain statements or behaviors. For example, an opinion task in which learners must choose the most suitable candidate for a scholarship out of a closed list of candidate descriptions.
Beyond their static or dynamic quality and their degree of abstractness, each task type can be made more difficult by increasing the number of elements and the relationships among them. Brown et al. Provide an example of a task in which one speaker must narrate a story to a listener. Thus, a story which involves four female characters interacting is more difficult to describe than one involving only one female and one male character. A story which involves several changes of scene or flashbacks to earlier events in time is more difficult than a story which occurs at a single time and location.
Differences of the three taxonomies or models of task difficulty will be flashed on your screen. You just have to pause the video and kindly read them. A friendly reminder that failure to do so means failure to meet the last objective or learning outcome set earlier.
The discussion tackled and explored the three main taxonomies or models of task difficulty or complexity. The discussion began by defining task from its most basic sense to more complex and linguistically related definitions where different authors defined it differently. Afterwards, the concept of limited attention capacity by Skehan and Long were next explored, followed by Robinson's triadic componential framework, and lastly, the concept of Ellis criteria for task grading. In the latter part of the discussion, the differences of the three models were also briefly discussed as to highlight their main points and their respective features.
That would be the end of my report. I hope you learned a lot. Once again, I am your future English educator, Lovely B. Mendoza. Keep safe and God bless. Bye bye.